Tonight, the picture-perfect handshake is cracking. Trade between China and Russia just fell off a cliff, sanctions are tightening, and no limit suddenly looks like no thanks. If Beijing is quietly stepping back while Moscow scrambles for buyers and tech, you're watching a partnership turn into a pressure point. Stay with me, because the numbers, the timing, and the fine print tell a very different story than the photo ops. August 2025. Trade between China and Russia takes a sudden dive. China's yuan-denominated exports to Russia in August post their sharpest drop since February. Chinese exports to Russia fall by over 16%, while Russian exports to China slide nearly 18%. For a relationship once hailed as a lifeline, those figures aren't just soft, they're a warning signal. Something fundamental is breaking. And yet, weeks later, Vladimir Putin is in Beijing, walking alongside Xi Jinping at a high-profile military parade. Red carpets. Cameras. Flawless choreography. From a distance, it looks like unity, two powers standing firm against the West. Up close, the fissures are spreading. Trust is thinning. China is easing back, and Russia is more isolated than at any point in decades. This isn't a pause, it's the start of a geopolitical unraveling. This isn't a petty disagreement, it's a strategic shift with real consequences. For years, Russia leaned hard on China to stay afloat under Western pressure. After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, sanctions bit deep. Europe slashed energy imports. The US froze assets and blocked critical tech. Access to global finance, machinery, and consumer goods collapsed almost overnight. Beijing became the lifeline. Moscow rerouted trade east, Chinese firms filled holes left by Western exits, Russian oil and gas moved to Chinese ports. In return, electronics, vehicles, and industrial parts flowed back into Russia. Empty shelves refilled. The Kremlin called it a pivot to the east. For a time, it looked durable. By 2023, bilateral trade hit records. Russian exports surged. Chinese imports stabilized Russia's domestic market. Leaders praised each other, signed energy deals, and spoke of a multipolar future. It looked like a long-term realignment. But that momentum has slowed sharply, and the data make it plain. What was sold as a blossoming partnership is losing steam. Why so fast? The simplest answer: China already took what it needed. In the first 2 years after the war escalated, Beijing rushed to stockpile discounted Russian oil, gas, and coal, while supplying consumer goods, cars, and electronics to replace Western brands. Now China's domestic energy reserves are full. Strategic stockpiles were built during the discount window. With its own energy transition accelerating, more solar, more wind, more refining capacity, it doesn't need to keep buying at crisis levels. Russia is discovering the hard truth: China won't keep expanding purchases just to prop up Moscow's economy. That's where the illusion shatters. Public displays of unity, friendship without limits, and endless pipeline headlines were crafted to project reliability. Beneath the lights, the relationship is different. Beijing is cautious and won't stick its neck out when costs spike. And those costs are rising. At the center is a tougher sanctions landscape. Not just the penalties in place since 2022, but a new wave changing the rules. Under Trump's latest push, Washington expands sanctions to target not only Russian firms, but any foreign companies that help them. That includes Chinese banks, manufacturers, and tech suppliers. Provide semiconductors, advanced machinery, or financial services, and you risk being cut off from the global dollar system. That threat lands. Trump doesn't bluff about leverage, and Xi knows it. One wrong move and the hammer falls. In another year, Beijing might have pushed harder. But right now is a terrible moment to pick a fight. Growth is slowing, the property sector is in crisis, youth unemployment is climbing, and financial stability depends on smooth access to dollars in Western markets. Getting blacklisted is not an affordable gamble. So, yes, China still buys some Russian oil and gas, but in reduced quantities. Meanwhile, deliveries of sensitive equipment slow. Big infrastructure projects stall or get quietly shelved. Chinese banks tighten compliance, making it harder for Russian firms to move money or secure credit. Joint ventures that once looked promising are stuck in limbo. Bold cooperation has become quiet hesitation. And you can't really blame Beijing. Beyond trade and banking, the pullback shows up in technology. Chinese tech firms are slowing or canceling co-development in AI, robotics, and telecoms. It's not just sanctions fear, it's strategy. China doesn't want its most advanced sectors tied to a struggling, sanctioned partner. Access to Western tech remains vital, and any hint that Chinese companies are handing sensitive systems or know-how to sanctioned Russian entities risks European or US blowback. Beijing won't take that bet. Russian demand for high-end chips, AI infrastructure, and cloud systems is up, but supply from China is shrinking, not only due to Washington's pressure, but because companies know the cost of getting caught. Some route goods through third countries, others scrap the deals entirely. Quiet decoupling, unannounced, unmistakable. And losing advanced tech may hurt Russia more than losing markets. It slows innovation, weakens defense industries, and deepens the isolation China was supposed to soften. Trump's strategy is blunt and effective, make helping Russia costlier than any benefit. In September 2025, he urges NATO and the EU to slap steep tariffs on Chinese goods if Beijing keeps buying Russian oil. He pushes for secondary sanctions hitting Chinese energy, finance, and tech firms directly. The message is simple: support Moscow and pay the price. Europe is tightening too. Diplomatic channels stay open, but concern over China's quiet support grows. Brussels coordinates more closely with Washington on secondary sanctions and export controls. Even Germany and France, once cautious, are warning about Beijing's dual role, one foot in the global economy, the other backing a sanctioned regime. For Beijing, antagonizing a €500 billion market is not a casual risk. If your priority is to stabilize growth and avoid more turbulence, you dial back support for Moscow. Domestic politics in China nudge in the same direction. State media avoids attacking Russia outright, but it isn't celebrating the war either. Online sentiment centers on jobs, housing, and growth. Among young people, appetite for getting entangled with Moscow is lukewarm. There's no push to be dragged into someone else's conflict with no clear win. Beijing is focused on self-preservation, not bailout diplomacy. That doesn't mean the partnership evaporates overnight, but it does mean hard boundaries. The more Washington turns the screws, the tighter those lines get. For Russia, that's dangerous. For Putin, it's painful. The entire eastward pivot assumed China would always be there to buy, sell, and invest. That assumption is collapsing. Beijing will help when it suits Beijing. It will not bleed for Russia, not under this pressure. And China isn't the only one taking a step back. India, one of Russia's biggest energy lifelines after 2022, is cooling, too. From May to August 2025, Indian purchases of Russian crude dropped by more than 30%, with spot cargoes nearly having compared to last year. Long-term contracts are quietly renegotiated, new deals stall. Some refiners demand steeper discounts, others shift volumes back to Gulf suppliers. Why? Secondary sanctions are starting to bite. Banks, insurers, and shippers tied to Russian barrels face tighter scrutiny. For Indian firms, the association cost is climbing. Unlike China, India doesn't have the scale, or incentive, to absorb that pressure. Western markets still matter more to Delhi than discounted oil. What Moscow once saw as a dependable fallback is turning transactional. All of this feeds into the bigger picture. The pivot east, once sold as Russia's escape from Western isolation, is losing momentum. China is drawing boundaries. India is hedging. Sanctions are biting harder. Russia has fewer options. The energy squeeze exposes the core vulnerability, a former heavyweight supplier now reliant on a handful of buyers, each with more leverage than the seller. Nowhere is that imbalance clearer than with China. Despite slogans and photo ops, the bond has never been equal. History is layered with rivalry and mistrust, border clashes in the 1960s, decades of competition for influence across the communist world. Today, the power dynamic is unmistakable. China is a manufacturing giant, the world's second largest economy, and a rising diplomatic force. Russia is increasingly an exporter of raw materials that must import technology it can no longer source from the West. China fills that gap, out of leverage, not loyalty. And Beijing's playbook is consistent. Across Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of Latin America, it extends loans, builds infrastructure, and opens markets, on terms that protect Chinese interests first. Countries like Sri Lanka, Kenya, and Laos have learned that support often comes with fine print and limited room to negotiate. With Russia, that imbalance is now public. It's not confined to trade, it spills into geopolitics. Central Asia, long within Moscow's orbit, is being reshaped by Chinese investment. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing has poured billions into Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and neighbors, roads, rails, pipelines, building durable influence. Russia's presence still matters, but its pull is fading. Leaders still meet in Moscow, more of them look to Beijing as the steadier, more generous partner. For Russia, it's humiliating, watching China take over a region once dominated, without firing a shot. Even on military questions, limits are glaring. Joint exercises and diplomatic theater make headlines, but reality is colder. Russia would love China to act more like North Korea, bold, confrontational, shipping weapons to the front. Beijing has drawn a line. No lethal aid for the war in Ukraine. No limits has limits because weapons would trigger serious Western sanctions and jeopardize China's economic ties with Europe and the US. North Korea, already isolated, takes risks it can afford. China, with global interests to protect, won't pay the price for someone else's war. The same imbalance plays out in infrastructure. The Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, touted in Moscow as a strategic coup, is, in practice, a deal shaped by Chinese interests. With China as the sole buyer, it controls pace, terms, and price. Europe once paid over $400 per thousand cubic meters of Russian gas, China pays closer to $270. That spread isn't just economics, it's leverage. No wonder Beijing shows no urgency, construction lags, financing is vague, timelines slip. For Russia it's a lifeline, for China, a flexible tap among many. Add it up and you get a relationship held together by appearances more than substance. In public, no limits. In practice, caution, conditions, and quiet retreat. Russia may present itself as China's closest ally. Behind closed doors, it knows how exposed it is. Beijing is playing the long game. Its approach isn't about loyalty or ideology, it's about strategy. Take what's useful, avoid what threatens stability. Energy will still flow. Goods will still cross the border. High-level meetings will still produce glowing statements. But real commitments stop at the tripwire of secondary sanctions. That's where the myth begins to unravel. The middle ground keeps the relationship alive without being dragged down by it. For the Kremlin, that's frustrating. Expectations of active support meet diplomacy, limited trade, and a growing sense of isolation. Each new deal's fine print says the quiet part out loud: China benefits more than Russia. The paths diverge. China wants global influence, balanced diplomacy, and economic leadership. Russia has chosen confrontation, isolation, and defiance. Those trajectories only run parallel for a while, then they separate. The unraveling is no longer just bilateral. It signals to the world that a feared counterweight to the West is weaker than it looked, a transactional arrangement, thin on cohesion, heavy on convenience. Perceptions are shifting. A once central energy supplier and geopolitical heavyweight now appears increasingly isolated, constrained economy, diminished leverage, fewer dependable partners. Moscow chases smaller markets with limited capacity and shallow depth, discounting oil and gas just to fund the war machine and keep the home front afloat. Margins shrink. Infrastructure to expand into new regions isn't ready. Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia can absorb some flow, they can't replace what's been lost. Inside Russia, pressure keeps mounting. Growth stalls. Banks strain. Imports are limited to what China still allows through. The Kremlin projects confidence, the stress shows anyway: shortages of industrial components, rising inflation, and officials quietly admitting the situation is difficult. China, meanwhile, keeps its distance, preserves its global image, calls for peace, maintains ties across divides, and avoids direct entanglement. That posture lets Beijing engage Europe, court the global south, and sidestep the isolation crippling Moscow. To many observers, China is playing both sides. Accurate. The advantages are obvious: stay clear of sweeping sanctions, present as a responsible power, and quietly benefit from Russia's desperation. Every barrel arrives at a discount. Every deal tilts Beijing's way. With no leverage left, Moscow accepts. That calculated distance keeps the relationship from deepening. No limits reads more like a slogan than a strategy. For the West, that matters. The panic about a tight China-Russia axis is giving way to a cooler read: this is transactional and fragile. In Central Asia, leaders who once feared being squeezed are now maneuvering: Russia in decline, China in control. In Africa, Russia's Wagner-style footprint lingers. China's economic role is broader and steadier. In the Middle East, both court Iran and Saudi Arabia. Beijing's financial clout gives it the edge while Moscow struggles to keep up. For the Kremlin, this isn't just disappointing, it's a strategic collapse. If China won't be the lifeline, who will? Iran and North Korea can offer weapons or buy discounted barrels, they can't fill the trade gap or provide the technology Moscow needs. They aren't substitutes, they're reminders of decline. Russia is more cornered than ever. It can't admit it publicly, but the truth is clear, no equal partners left, only transactional ones who take what they need and walk when the costs climb. Moscow thought it was shaping a new order. Instead, it's watching its closest ally edge away. This is a slow-motion breakup with global consequences. Europe sees an opening, sanctions are biting harder than expected. Washington sees proof that Beijing won't torch bridges with the West to shield Moscow. Middle powers, from Turkey and Brazil to Saudi Arabia, are recalibrating in a world where Russia looks weaker and less reliable. In Asia, the shift is even starker. Beijing won't be dragged into Moscow's war. Its focus is the Pacific and competition with the United States. The last thing Xi wants is to burn political capital or lose market access because of Putin's miscalculations. So China adjusts, scale back sensitive exports, increase dialogue with Europe, keep Western trade open. Support Russia just enough to keep it afloat, but never enough to jeopardize China's larger ambitions. Where does this leave Russia? Locked in a partnership it doesn't control, tied to a global power that's steadily stepping back. China will keep buying, but only at deep discounts. It will appear for photo ops, but not for bailouts. As the war drags on, the distance grows. No limits was never friendship, it was strategy. And right now, China's strategy is survival. That leaves Moscow with fewer reliable partners, a shrinking economy, and a future shaped not by its own plans, but by limits others impose. The breakup won't be announced. But it's happening. And for Russia, that's the real crisis.